You know, they say you spend the first half of your life building something and the second half watching it weather. I never understood that until last Tuesday. It was a cool October morning, the kind where the light slants through the kitchen window just so. I was sorting the mail, just like I have for 40 years. Bills, advertisements, and then a large manila envelope addressed to my grandson, Benjamin. My hands didn't tremble when I opened it. I was just being helpful, you see. It was a school project, a family history assignment. There was a beautiful tree drawn with branches and names. I looked for my name. I looked again. From the very root of that tree to its highest leaf, my name was nowhere to be found. The father branch simply ended at my wife, Clara, as if I had never been there at all. This is not a story about anger. It is a story about quiet disappearance. If you have ever given your life to something only to find your signature gently erased from the work, well then you might understand what I'm about to tell you. Before I continue, I want to say something. Stories like this aren't rare, they just don't get talked about. If you've ever felt ignored, pushed aside, or hurt by the people you trusted most, you're not alone. Many people listening right now have lived something similar, and sometimes reading the comments helps more than we realize. If this story already feels familiar, you're welcome here. My name is Robert Hayes, and I am 78 years old. I built my life on simple things: duty, patience, the belief that a man's legacy is his family. I was not a perfect father, but I was a present one. For 34 years, I worked as a foreman at the Johnson Tool and Die plant. My hands were always clean by dinner time, but my shoulders carried a permanent ache. Clara and I raised 3 children in a 3-bedroom house on Elm Street. Michael, the oldest, Sarah, our determined middle child, and David, the youngest, who always saw the world in softer colors. We were not a family of grand gestures. Our love was measured in packed lunches and mortgage payments, in sitting through endless school recitals and driving across 3 states for soccer tournaments. I remember the years Clara was sick. The cancer that took her in the end was a slow thief, and after she was gone, the children became my entire world. I helped with down payments. I babysat grandchildren. I was the steady hand they could always call. When David's business failed, I gave him the money from my savings, not a loan, a gift. When Sarah went through her divorce, I painted her new apartment myself. For Michael, I kept his old baseball cards for 30 years because he once mentioned they might be valuable. These were not sacrifices to me. This was the job. This was what a father does. The warning signs were so small I mistook them for life's natural changes. The phone calls grew shorter, more functional. Conversations that were once about thoughts and feelings became updates on schedules and weather. Holidays began to shift. First, it was Christmas Eve instead of Christmas Day to accommodate other families. Then it was just a brunch. The year the grandchildren stopped sending handmade birthday cards, I told myself they were just busy with school. The real change began after my heart attack. It was a moderate one, the doctor said. I was lucky, but it necessitated a talk about the future. I sat them all down at Sarah's dining room table. I had my papers in order: will, living will, power of attorney. I told them my only wish was to stay in my own home for as long as possible. I saw the look that passed between them. It was not a look of concern. It was a look of logistics. Michael cleared his throat. He said, "Dad, we all think it's time to consider a community, a place with people your own age where you won't have to worry about the stairs." Sarah nodded quickly, adding that it would be a relief to know I was safe. Only David was quiet, his eyes on the tablecloth. I told them I appreciated their worry, but my mind was made up. The house was paid for, and I could manage. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. It was the first time I had ever said no to them. The distance grew palpable after that meeting. Visits became announced events, never spontaneous drop-ins. My suggestions were met with polite deflection. Then came the weekend of my 70th birthday. They had planned a party at Michael's house. I arrived with a cake, Clara's recipe. The house was full of their friends and colleagues, people I did not know. I sat in a corner chair and watched. I heard Michael telling a story about his childhood, a story about teaching him to ride a bike. But in his telling, the father figure was vague, a composite. He never said, "my dad." He said, "You know how parents are." Later, Sarah's husband, Mark, was showing a guest their family photo wall. I walked over slowly. There were pictures of Clara, pictures of the children growing up, pictures of grandchildren. But the pictures of me, the pictures with me in them, they were all gone. In their place were landscapes and abstract art. I felt a coldness start in my chest. I asked Sarah about it quietly. She glanced at the wall, then back at me with a faint smile. She said, "Oh, Daddy, that wall was so cluttered, we just wanted to modernize it a bit. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. It was the first brick removed, and I was too stunned to protest. I drove home that night under a clear black sky. The cake was still in its box on the passenger seat. For the first time, I wondered if the life I had built was still my own, or if it had been quietly subdivided and sold off without my knowledge. The final betrayal was not a single event, but an erosion. It was the discovery that they had created a new family group chat without me. David told me about it by accident, his face flushing with guilt. "We did it for planning," they said, "so as not to bother me with details." Then it was the family tree project that arrived in my mailbox. But the most profound erasure happened last spring. I received a call from my old neighbor, Fred Miller. His voice was hesitant. He said, "Bob, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm at the Historical Society's exhibit on local families, and well, there's a display here for the Hayes family." I went down there myself. The exhibit was in a bright room filled with the smell of old paper. And there it was, a large, beautiful panel dedicated to Michael Hayes and his lineage. It spoke of his business success, his community leadership. It listed Clara as a beloved mother. It showed photographs of my children and grandchildren. My photograph was not there. My name was not there. In the narrative of our family's history, I had become a footnote so faint it was no longer printed. I stood there for a long time. People brushed past me, chatting about the past. I felt a profound silence settle over me. Not the silence of anger, but the silence of a fact. To my own family, I had become inconvenient, a story that no longer needed to be told. I did not confront them about the exhibit. What would have been the point? The evidence was now public, and their choice was deliberate. I drove home and made a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me. I sat at the kitchen table where I had helped with so much homework so many years ago, and I began to think, not with heat, but with a cold clarity that surprised me. This was not a mistake. This was not an oversight. Erasing a man requires effort. It means selecting different photographs. It means editing biographies. It means answering a child's questions about their grandfather with vague answers. I thought of my own father, a quiet man who worked with wood. His hands were always nicked and scarred. He left me a mahogany toolbox. I still have it. It is solid and real to the touch. You cannot edit out a man whose name is carved into the handle of a tool you still use. That was the week I stopped reaching out. I did not make the Sunday calls. I did not send the newspaper clippings about things I thought might interest them. The silence from their end became absolute. It confirmed everything. My days took on a new rhythm. I visited the library. I took long walks. I began to write down my memories, not for them, but for myself. I wrote about Clara. I wrote about the smell of the factory. I wrote about teaching Michael to shave and Sarah to drive, and the time David and I built a model ship that never quite floated right. On paper, I existed. The holidays came and went. A Thanksgiving card arrived from Sarah, a generic scene of pumpkins with just her name signed at the bottom. No mention of a visit, no question of my plans. On Christmas Eve, I attended a community candlelight service. I saw families together and felt not envy, but a strange detachment. I was mourning people who were still alive. Then, in February, a fall. Nothing broken, but it shook my confidence. The hospital called Michael as my emergency contact. He arrived looking tense and inconvenienced. He spoke to the doctors with an authority that did not include me. He said, "We really need to discuss assisted living." I looked at my son, a man of 50, with my chin and Clara's eyes, and I said, "No, we will not discuss it. I am going home." The drive back was silent. He helped me inside and stood in the doorway fidgeting with his keys. He said, "Dad, you're being stubborn. You're not thinking of us." That sentence hung in the air between us. You're not thinking of us. For 50 years, I had thought of almost nothing else. I nodded slowly and said, "Michael, I have thought of you every day of your life, but you are a grown man. You do not need my thoughts anymore. Now I need to think of myself." He left without another word. That night I made a decision. It was not a decision of anger. It was a decision of dignity. I called my lawyer, old Jerry Simmons, who handled Clara's affairs. I told him I wanted to change my will. He came to the house the following week. We sat in the living room with the legal pad between us on the coffee table. I explained my wishes calmly. The house, the savings, the investments, the life insurance. I redirected everything. A portion would establish a small vocational scholarship at the local high school in Clara's name for students interested in skilled trades. The rest would go to the city's Historical Preservation Society with a single stipulation: that they create a permanent archive of oral histories from the men and women who worked at the Johnson plant. My name would be on the donor plaque, Robert Hayes. It would be cast in bronze and screwed to a wall. You cannot erase bronze. The will itself contained a brief explanatory letter. It stated that since I had been removed from the family history, I saw no need to remain in its future. I wished them no ill will. I simply wished to place my legacy where it would be remembered. Signing those papers was the most peaceful moment I had felt in years. It was not revenge, it was alignment, a correction of the record. I did not tell the children. They would learn of it in time. I continued my routines. I had coffee with Fred Miller. I volunteered at the tool library, teaching young people how to handle a plane or a chisel. I found a quiet purpose in being useful outside the boundaries of blood. Then, one afternoon in early summer, David came to see me. He came alone. He looked weary. He sat on the porch steps, and I brought us 2 glasses of iced tea. He did not speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "Benjamin asked about you. He's working on another project about where he comes from. He asked why Grandpa isn't on the tree." I took a slow drink of tea. The ice cubes clinked softly, and I asked, "What did you tell him?" David's face crumpled then. He put his head in his hands. He said, "I told him it was a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake, Dad. It was just easier. Michael and Sarah, they said you were becoming a burden. They said your stories were repetitive. They said simplifying things was better for the grandchildren. I went along with it. I am so sorry." The apology hung there in the humid air. I looked at my youngest son, and I felt a tremendous sadness for him. He was always the gentle one, and gentleness is often no match for a united front. I said, "I know you are, David. Thank you for telling me. But an apology only mends the tear between the two people saying it. It does not reweave the whole cloth." He asked what he could do. I told him he could bring Benjamin around sometime. I would tell him about his grandmother. I would show him how to use his hands. But as for the rest of it, the family history, I said that was no longer my concern. They had written their version, and I had written mine. David did bring Benjamin around the following Saturday. The boy was 10, all knees and elbows, and a serious look in his eyes. We sat at the workbench in my garage. I showed him his great-grandfather's toolbox. I let him feel the weight of a hammer. I told him about Clara, how she could fix a leaking faucet faster than any plumber, and how she always kept peppermints in her apron pocket. We did not speak of the family tree. We spoke of tangible things. Before they left, David hugged me. It was a quick, tight embrace. He said, "Thank you, Grandpa." That visit was a small, soft truth in a year of quiet falsehoods. I heard nothing from Michael or Sarah. The season turned to fall again. The maple tree in the front yard blazed a brilliant red. It was during this time that Jerry Simmons called to tell me the paperwork was finalized and filed. He said, "Robert, are you sure about this? It's a permanent instruction." I told him I was never more sure. A man must steward his legacy where it will be respected. The revelation came, as they often do, through the dry language of law. My annual review statement from the financial firm contained a routine note about the change of beneficiary on the life insurance policy. It was mailed to me, but a copy was also sent to Michael, as he was still listed as a contact on the account. He called me that evening. His voice was not angry. It was cold and bewildered. He said, "Dad, I got a letter from Harrison Financial. It says you've removed us from your life insurance. What is this about?" I told him it was about historical accuracy. Since I am no longer part of the family history, it seemed inconsistent to remain part of its financial future. The silence on the phone was profound. He sputtered, saying that was ridiculous, that the family tree was a child's project, that I was overreacting. I let him speak. When he finished, I said, "Michael, you are a smart man. You understand that actions have consequences. The exhibit at the Historical Society was not a child's project. The photo wall in your sister's home was not a child's project. You made a conscious decision to erase me. I have made a conscious decision to accept that." He said, "We need to have a family meeting." I told him there was no family left to meet. The family you are thinking of lives in your memory. It does not live in this house anymore. He hung up then. I sat and watched the last of the light fade from the leaves outside. The confrontation I had quietly dreaded never came. Sarah called once. Her voice was sharp with wounded pride. She said, "How could you do this to your grandchildren?" I replied softly that I had done nothing to them. I had simply followed the path their parents laid out. I asked her if Benjamin had enjoyed his visit. She went quiet. That was the last time we spoke. The machinery of their lives, which had once included me as a central gear, now operated smoothly in my absence. I heard through Fred that Michael had told people I was becoming difficult, that my mind was not what it used to be. It was the final strategic edit to the narrative. If the father is erased because he is feeble, then the children are not cruel, they are responsible. I let that lie sit in the world. Arguing would only give it credence. Instead, I focused on the archive project with the Historical Society. I spent my Tuesday afternoons in a small recording booth telling stories about the plant, the smell of cutting oil, the sound of the stamp press, the pride in a finished part that met tolerance. My voice was being preserved. The plaque was installed in the society's lobby on a bright, cold day in January. I went to see it alone. There it was, a simple bronze rectangle, the Robert and Clara Hayes Collection for Industrial Memory. I ran my fingers over the raised letters. It was solid. It was real. A passerby could see it and know I existed. That spring, I felt a shift within myself. The loneliness, which had been a cold companion, began to thaw. It was replaced by a kind of quiet freedom. I had stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I had stopped anticipating invitations that would not come. My life became my own again for the first time since I was a young man. I planted a garden. I joined a weekly chess group at the senior center. The men there had their own stories of disappointment and pride. We did not dwell on them. We focused on the board in front of us, the strategic movement of pieces, the satisfaction of a well-defended king. Then, one afternoon in late summer, I returned from the library to find a car in my driveway. It was Michael's. He was standing on the porch looking at the hanging fern Clara had always kept there, now lush and green under my care. He turned as I approached. He looked older. There was a grayness to his face that worried me despite everything. He said, "Hello, Dad. Can we talk?" I should continue from where the last segment left off, Michael's unexpected visit. The father's response should be consistent with his character, restrained, dignified, and unwilling to revert to old dynamics. The interaction should reveal Michael's motivations without villainizing him, showing his human flaws and regrets. The consequences of the father's actions, the once changed will, and the historical archive should come into play here, but not as a triumphant victory. Instead, they should serve as the backdrop for a painful but necessary conversation about accountability and legacy. The resolution should be bittersweet, with the father finding peace in his own terms, even if full reconciliation isn't possible. I'll use the garage scene as the setting for this conversation, echoing the earlier moment with Benjamin. The toolbox and other tangible objects can symbolize the father's enduring presence. The dialogue should be sparse and meaningful, with silences carrying as much weight as words. The ending should leave the father in a place of quiet acceptance, his dignity restored, but his family bonds forever changed. I unlocked the door and led him inside to the kitchen, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals. I put the kettle on for tea, a habit from Clara. We sat. The silence was heavy but not hostile. It was the silence of a bridge long collapsed. Michael's hands rested on the table, and I noticed they were my hands, the same broad knuckles, the same faint scar across the right thumb. He did not speak immediately. He was gathering himself. Finally, he said, "I went to the Historical Society. I saw the plaque. I listened to some of the recordings. Your voice is the first one." I nodded. The whistle of the kettle broke the quiet. I poured the water. The steam rose between us. He said, "You talk about the plant. You talk about Mom. You don't mention us." I stirred my tea. I said, "No, I don't." 2. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He said, "We're your children." I said, "Yes, you are, and you are adults who made a choice. The archive is not about you. It is about the things that cannot be erased." He looked down at his cup. His shoulders slumped. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. "We just thought it was easier. The stories you told were from a different world. The kids didn't understand. Sarah said it was confusing for them." I asked him what was confusing. He looked at me then, and his eyes were lost. He said that you stayed, that you worked with your hands, that you were content with a small life. We wanted to give them a bigger story. And there it was,
the quiet heart of it all. My life, my small, honest life, was an embarrassment to the narrative they were building for themselves. I felt no anger, only a deep, immense sadness. I said, Michael, a story isn't big because it has ambition in it. A story is big because it has truth in it. You tried to make yours bigger by cutting mine out. That only made it smaller. He did not argue. He said, David won't speak to me. Sarah is furious about the money. And Benjamin asks me questions I can't answer. I asked him what Benjamin wanted to know. He said, he asks why Grandpa knows how to fix things and I don't. He asks what you were like when I was a boy. I finished my tea. The afternoon light was fading. I said, those are good questions. You should try to answer them. He said, will you help me? The words seemed to cost him a great deal. I told him I would not help him craft a new story, but I would be willing to answer Benjamin's questions directly if he brought him here. As for him and Sarah, I said, that was a bridge burned by their own hands. I cannot rebuild it for them. He stayed for another hour. We did not talk of wills or legacies. We talked of practical things, the loose shingle on the roof, the old apple tree in the back that wasn't bearing fruit. It was the conversation of two acquaintances, polite and distant. When he left, he stood on the porch again. He said, I am sorry, Dad. I know it doesn't change anything. I said, I know you are, and you're right. It doesn't. I watched his car back out of the driveway. The red taillights disappeared down Elm Street. I felt an old door close inside me, not with a slam, but with the soft, final click of a lock engaging. The following weeks were calm. I tended my garden, I worked on the archive, I played chess.
Then a letter arrived from a law firm representing Sarah. It was a formal inquiry about the changes to the estate. A challenge was implied. I gave the letter to Jerry Simmons. He read it and laughed a dry, papery sound. He said, Robert, she has no standing. You are of sound mind, and the documents are ironclad. But she can make a nuisance. I told him to handle it. I would not be drawn into a legal battle. It was beneath whatever dignity we had left. Jerry sent a firm reply. I heard nothing more. The season turned. The first frost silvered the grass. My days developed a rhythm that was wholly my own. I found I did not mind the solitude. It was not emptiness. It was space. And then on a Tuesday, much like the one when this all began, David brought Benjamin again. This time he had a notebook. He said he had a new assignment, to interview someone who had a job that didn't require a college degree. We sat in the garage. He asked careful questions and wrote down my answers with great concentration. What did you make? Was it hard? Were you proud? I showed him blueprints. I showed him the feel of a micrometer. His small hand turned the dial with awe. When they were leaving, David hesitated at the car door. He said, the challenge was dropped. Sarah didn't want it to go to court. He said it like it was good news. I simply nodded. It was not news to me. I had known the outcome already. Some things are simply facts. That winter was a quiet one. I saw Benjamin a handful of times. David would bring him for an hour here and there. We built a birdhouse from scrap wood. I told him stories about Clara that made him laugh. It was a thin but genuine thread. Michael did not return. I heard he had taken a promotion that required more travel. Sarah moved out of state for her husband's job. The family they had curated was now geographically scattered. The center had not held. On a bright, cold morning in March, I walked to the Historical Society. I sat on the bench opposite my plaque and I watched people pass by. Some would glance at it, most did not. It did not matter. It was there. A young man with a tool bag slung over his shoulder stopped and read it. He nodded once to himself and moved on. That was the moment I felt it. A sense of completion. Not happiness, not victory, but a quiet settling of accounts. I had been erased from one history, so I had placed myself firmly in another. A history of hands and tools and quiet labor. A history that would outlast the whims of ashamed children. I walked home slowly. The sun was weak but bright. I thought of Clara. I hoped she would understand. I believed she would. The house was waiting for me. It was full of the life we had built together, the good and the difficult, all of it true. I made lunch. I listened to the radio. The afternoon stretched out peaceful and mine. The phone did not ring, and I no longer expected it to. Spring returned. The earth softened, and the lilacs by the garage burst into fragrant bloom. It was during this season of renewal that I received a package, a large flat cardboard envelope addressed in a careful hand I did not recognize. Inside, I found Benjamin's completed school project, a new family tree. This one was not a single page, but a small handmade book. The cover was titled Hayes Family Toolbox. With a quiet heart, I opened it. The first page was a traced outline of my father's mahogany toolbox. The following pages held stories, not just names and dates, but the stories I had told him. Here was a page about Clara and the peppermints. Here was a drawing of the Johnson plant. Here was a description of how to true a board with a hand plane. On the final page was a photograph. It was the one from my work ID badge circa 1978. A young man with steady eyes. Underneath, Benjamin had written, "My grandpa Robert. He made things that were useful, and he remembers everything." I held that book in my hands for a long time. It was not a correction of the official record. It was something better, a parallel record, one created by a boy who sought the truth and found it in a dusty garage. I called David that evening. I thanked him for sending it. He said, "It was all Benjamin's idea. He worked on it for months." Then he said, "Sarah's moving back. The marriage didn't last. She's living with a friend for now." I absorbed this news. I asked no questions. He offered no more. The consequences were now simply the landscape of their lives. I had no desire to tour it. Summer deepened. I was in the backyard repotting a fern when I heard a car door shut. I looked up and saw Sarah standing at the side gate. She was alone. She looked tired. She carried a bakery box. I wiped my hands on my trousers and nodded to her. She came in slowly. We sat on the porch steps just as David had. She opened the box. It was a lemon cake, my favorite. She said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say that I was wrong. Not about the logistics or the stress. I was wrong about the story." She did not cry. Her voice was clear and worn. She said, "I thought we were curating something, making a cleaner, simpler narrative for the next generation. I thought your life, your steady, quiet life, was a prologue to ours, something to be summarized and set aside. I see now that a prologue is not less important than the story. It is the foundation upon which every page rests. Without it, the narrative collapses." I looked at my daughter. I saw the woman she was and the girl she had been. I said, "Sarah, you are my child. I will always love you. But love is not the same as trust, and respect cannot be demanded once it has been discarded. We can be civil. We can share a cake on a porch, but the relationship you had with me is a part of that history you tried to edit. It is gone." She nodded. She cut a slice of cake with the paper server and handed it to me on a napkin. We ate in silence, watching a robin hunt for worms in the grass. It was not reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement, a treaty between two separate nations. She left before the evening cooled. She did not ask to come inside. She did not ask about the will or the house. She simply said, "Thank you for the cake, Dad," and then she was gone. That was the last of the great reckonings. What followed was life as it is, uneven, messy, real. Benjamin turned 11, and I gave him my father's toolbox. He accepted it with a solemnity that suited the occasion. David visits once a month. We talk of small things. The visit is a habit he is rebuilding. It is comfortable. Sarah sends a card on my birthday. I send one on hers. Michael and I do not speak. Some silences become permanent features. This past week, I went downtown to run an errand. I passed the storefront that once housed Miller's Hardware. It's a coffee shop now. Through the window, I saw a young father holding a toddler. He was pointing to something on the menu, and the child was laughing. I stood there for a moment. I did not feel envy. I did not feel bitterness. I felt a strange and peaceful detachment. That man was building his story. He does not know yet how it ends. He does not know which chapters his children will choose to revisit or which they will try to burn. I walked on. My destination was the Historical Society. They were installing a listening station for the Oral History Archive. They asked me to record a short introduction. I sat in the booth with the headphones on. The technician gave me a signal. I cleared my throat and I began to speak. My name is Robert Hayes. I worked at the Johnson Tool and Die plant for 34 years. This is the sound of a stamp press. This is the smell of cutting oil. This is the weight of a finished part in your hand. I spoke for 2 minutes. Just the facts. Just the sensory truth. When I was done, the technician played it back. I heard my voice, an old man's voice, steady and calm. It will play on a loop in that room for years, long after I am gone. I left the building and stood on the steps. The sun was warm on my face. I thought of the manila envelope that had started it all, the family tree that had no branch for me. That tree was a fiction, a desperate pruning, but a tree cannot grow without its roots, and roots are not always visible. They work in the dark. They sustain. They endure. I walked home. My pace was slow, my shadow long before me. The house was quiet when I arrived. It was waiting. I made a cup of tea and sat in my chair by the window. The silence was not empty. It was full of a life lived. It was my silence, and it was enough. The years have a way of sanding down the sharp edges of even the deepest wounds, not removing them, but making them smooth to the touch. I live in a house still. The rooms hold their memories, but they no longer echo. My routine is a comfort: morning coffee with the newspaper, a walk to the post office, Tuesday afternoons at the Historical Society, where I have become a volunteer of sorts, a living exhibit. People sometimes recognize my voice from the listening station. They will say, "You're the tool and die man." I nod and say, "Yes, I am." Benjamin is 14 now. He comes every other Saturday, not out of duty, but interest. We are working on restoring an old wooden dinghy, a project that will likely take us years. He asks better questions now. He asked me once if I was angry at his father and his aunt and uncle. I told him I was not angry. Anger is for a wrong that can be righted. This was a choice they made, and they have to live inside it. I said my feeling was closer to sorrow, and sorrow is a weight you learn to carry without staggering. He thought about that. Then he said, "I think they're ashamed, not just about the tree, but about everything. They don't know how to fix it, so they pretend it didn't happen." Out of the mouths of children. David is doing better. He found work he enjoys, managing a small hardware store. He says it reminds him of coming here with me on Saturdays. He brings his son, and they walk the aisles together. a small redemption. Sarah is living in an apartment across town. She calls on my birthday and on Clara's. Our conversations are careful and kind. We speak of the weather and of Benjamin. We do not speak of the past. It is a truce I can accept. Michael, I learned through the slow gossip of a small town, has divorced. He sold the big house and moved to a condo. I heard he took a trip to Europe alone. I do not know if he found what he was looking for. I suspect he did not. I saw him once last winter. I was leaving the library and he was entering. We stood on the steps in the cold. He said, "Hello, Dad." I said, "Michael." He looked at the books in my hand and said, "Still reading history?" I said, "I find it instructive." He nodded. There was nothing else to say. We went our separate ways. That encounter did not sadden me. It simply was, a confirmation of a distance that had become geographic as well as emotional. Some relationships are not meant to be repaired. They are meant to be acknowledged as finished. And there is a dignity in that, too. My health is stable. The heart medicine works. My hands are still steady enough for fine work. I have outlived the prognosis they gave me after the attack. I take a small, stubborn pride in that. The archive at the Historical Society is growing. Families of other workers have come forward with photographs and stories. My name is on the door of the small collection room now. People see it. They may not know who I was, but they know I was here. This is the quiet justice I have found. Not a reckoning for them, but a peace for me. I did not need them to admit their fault. I needed to know my own worth without their endorsement. And I do. Last week, Benjamin brought his friend Jacob over. They were working on a school project about local history. Benjamin led him to the bookshelf and took down the handmade book, Hayes Family Toolbox. He showed it to his friend and said, "This is my grandpa's story. He's in the real history books too, down at the society." I was in the kitchen and I heard those words. They were not loud, they were not dramatic, but they settled in the room like a truth finally spoken. Later, after Jacob left, Benjamin stayed for dinner. We were eating stew and he said, "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." He said, "Do you regret it, giving them everything when they were kids?" I put my spoon down. I thought of Christmas mornings and skinned knees and college tuition checks. I said, "No, Benjamin, I do not regret a single dime or a single moment. I regret that they could not bear the weight of that gift. That is a different thing entirely." He thought about that. Then he said, "I think they're ashamed." He seemed to understand. He said, "I won't do that." I said, "I know you won't." And in that moment, I saw my legacy not in bronze or in a will, but in the eyes of a boy who had learned a hard lesson early and would carry it with him. The story I set out to tell you is nearly done. It is not a story of vengeance. It is a story of visibility. For so many years, I defined myself by my visibility to my family. I was the provider, the helper, the father. When they chose to make me invisible, I shattered. It took time, a great deal of quiet time, to understand that my visibility to myself was the only one that ever truly mattered. And then to make that self visible to the world in a way that could not be easily erased. So here is what I have learned. Love is not a guarantee. It is a gift that can be refused or misplaced. Duty is not a contract that ensures remembrance. It is a personal code you live by for your own integrity. And legacy. Legacy is not what you leave to people. It is what you leave in them. Even if it is only in one of them. They acted as if I never existed, and for a time I feared they were right. But a man exists by his own measure, by the work of his hands, by the truth of his memories, by the quiet impact he has on a single young life. I exist. I am Robert Hayes. I loved a woman named Clara for 41 years. I raised 3 children to the best of my ability. I made useful things. And now I tend a garden and tell stories into a microphone. It is a good life. It is my life. The sun is setting as I finish speaking to you. The light is that rich golden color that makes everything look timeless. I can hear a lawnmower in the distance and the chatter of squirrels in the oak tree. It is an ordinary evening, the kind I have learned to cherish. I have no grand final words, no sweeping moral, only this. If you find yourself erased from a story you helped write, do not spend your fury trying to scratch your name back into their margins. Take your pen, find a fresh page, and begin again. Tell your story true. Someone, someday, might need to read it. I shared this story because silence hides too much pain. If it reminded you of your own life, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone may need your words. And if these stories matter to you, you're always welcome to subscribe.